every creature, every living creature interacts with its world. And even, every speck of dust from a theological perspective has all that it has from God.
This week's guest is the Reverend Professor Andrew Davison, Regius Professor of Divinity at the University of Oxford.
Well, a Regius Professor is a professorship, a chair that was founded by a king or a queen. And generally they still have a minor hand in making the appointment. So it has to go through Downing Street. And to know something is to open yourself up to it, to let it impinge upon you, to let it inform you. And we live in an age when there's a whole economy that's trying to steal our attention. I think that there's something about human courage and goodness when you encounter it that just stops me in my tracks. I find that is a great antidote to nihilism. Hear the stories of the saints and people who've just done the right thing in terrible circumstances. I find it very difficult to believe that nothing means anything. I don't think I've ever really been convinced by the idea that science answers all the questions that there are.
How persuaded have you been by those kinds of philosophical arguments that reality itself is somehow evidence for God?
To a brand spanking new episode of Re-Enchanting, the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen. I'm Belle Tyndall.
And I'm Justin Briley.
And we are about to have another conversation about our favourite theme, re-enchantment. Whether our arguably materialistic, disenchanted world is craving re-enchantment, and if so, whether the Christian story can be the source of it.
This week's guest is the Reverend Professor Andrew Davison, Regius Professor of Divinity at the University of Oxford. Andrew has both a scientific and theological background and has frequently worked on the intersection of science and faith, as well as writing on participation and the sacramental theology of blessing in books such as Participation in God and Blessing. So Andrew is really an ideal guest for Re-Enchanting, as he says we need to rethink separating things into the categories of the natural and the supernatural, because enchantment is part and parcel of the way the world is and the way we engage it. So today, in a rather grand title, we are going to be attempting to re-enchant reality itself. So no small task for you this morning.
Yeah,
Andrew.
No pressure, Andrew. But before we ask you to re-enchant reality, firstly, we're on top of Lambeth Palace Library, and so our first question is always an ode to our home, and it's what you're reading at the moment.
Well, I'm carrying around in my bag a wonderful little book by Julian Green called Paris, which was published in 1984, I think, but some parts of it are 40 years older than that. And it's his reminiscences of living in Paris. It's a really beautiful little book. I'm also reading, just started, a book by Scott Burnham called Mozart's Grace, about why Mozart's music is so beautiful.
Lovely. Do you listen to much music? Does it go alongside the reading?
Yeah, I think outside of theology, philosophy, science, music's my biggest interest, really.
Fantastic. We ask this question because there's lots of connections very often between the things our guests are reading and perhaps the things they're interested in they do professionally. Do you tend to find yourself reading for pleasure or more for the purposes of research and the things you're doing at the moment?
Well, I'm always reading for research, except I think when I'm really busy, it's maybe the first thing that goes. So I'm always grateful for a sabbatical or a vacation when I can catch up again on some reading. But yeah, I do always keep some reading for pleasure going, quite often non-fiction, but also like many clerics, I read a lot of detective novels as well. That seems to be quite a thing that goes with the territory of.
That does, doesn't it? Why is that?
People have written whole essays on this.
Oh,
I don't know.
way.
Yeah,
no way.
I think P.D. James wrote an essay, and W.H. Auden wrote an essay about the clergy and detective novels.
Yes.
I don't know, like Justice and Resolution or something.
Sure.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose also the clergy spend quite a lot of time with people and psychology and so on. And these books are quite often good studies of
Yes.
human behavior and
course.
personality.
How fascinating.
There's a long tradition of clerics doing the crime solving as well, isn't there? Of course, Father Brown and all that. But anyway, we're not here to talk about detectives and crime. We're here to talk about really deep philosophical, theological issues, but we'll try and keep it at a level that is
Please
accessible as well, because you are, as I said, the Regius Professor of Divinity, the University of Oxford. That for some people, that will sound a bit like some sort of title from Harry Potter or something, But before we leap into our theme, what is a Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford University?
Well, a Regius Professor is a professorship, a chair that was founded by a king or a queen. And generally, they still have a minor hand in making the appointment. So it has to go through Downing Street, and the king has to spend at least 15 seconds, looking at I don't know. He's quite devout, so maybe he puts more time in than that. But so it's the particular set of professorships in quite a lot of disciplines now. Ancient languages, but also medicine and law and that sort of thing. And the Regius Professor of Divinity, I suppose you could have a different focus in different times of history, but in the last few centuries, the last century, it's been focused on all those big ideas that turn up in the Creed. The Nicene Creed is 1,700 years old next year in 2025. So all those things about God, creation, sin, salvation, who Jesus is, they've been the mainstay of the Regius Professor of Divinity's interest.
I mean, I have to say, you're not our first Regius Professor on the podcast. I think Luke Bretherton was possibly our first.
It had just been announced that both of you were taking these Regius Professorships, and we had Luke Bretherton just soothing our souls about the general election that was coming up at the time.
Regius Professor of, is it moral philosophy?
Moral and pastoral theology.
That's it, yes.
So.
Yes. There you go. Anyway, we've invited you here onto Re-Enchanting. And when I first had this conversation with you, Andrew, you said, I'm not sure I approve of the title of your podcast. Could you explain what the problem is with the whole concept of re-enchanting?
Well, it's just the re bit, I think, that I thought... I didn't want to suppose that whatever we mean by enchantment, we'll come on to that in a moment, was something that was just imposed from the outside, sort of painted on, sprayed on, or as if it was like some kind of spiritual Instagram filter. So I think it's important to say that whatever we mean by enchantment, which might be things being wonderful or good or deep or meaningful, I think these are more discovered than imposed. So that's all I meant by the...
Are you saying that we can't go about re-enchanting things that are by their nature already enchanted in that sense?
Well, I just worried that it would suggest that you had a basically inert, meaningless, non-wonderful, non-deep reality that one then had to make those things. I don't think you meant that, but I wanted to talk about that part of the word.
Yes, yeah. So would you feel that almost like re-noticing might be a more accurate title?
It might be more accurate, but it wouldn't be particularly lyrical. So I think you should stick with what you've got.
You're not suggesting we change the title of the podcast
no.
mid-season. No.
In which case, so it's a riff from, as I imagine Max Weber's Age of Disenchantment, or I think in more literal translation, demagification. So so what do you think about that then? The idea that, I think I know your answer to this, but the idea that we have the power to disenchant something, I imagine that's as illogical as us having the power to re-enchant something.
Well, I think it's not just a matter of what things are, but also what we do with them. And that with the dawn of, well, at least of human beings, then you have the cultural dimension, and that which has a certain wonder just by virtue of its nature is elevated to a yet higher level, becomes yet more glorious because we sing about it or write poems about it, write stories about it. So I think in that sense, I don't want to say that the world just is and we're passive. I think we meet it halfway and we draw it up into human lives, which is a wonderful thing. So partly this disenchantment would be just missing what's there.
Yeah.
But also it would be a missing of what we can do with it, or what it can mean to us.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to dive deeper into this whole question, which the work you've done and the research you've done just dovetails beautifully with that whole theme. But let's find out a bit more about you first, Andrew. So, as I say, you've got this scientific and theological background. How did that happen? Because I think really you started out in biochemistry. That was sort of what you were doing. How did you go from that into theology eventually?
Well, a chemistry degree first, and then a DPhil in biochemistry. Science was just what I was good at school, so it always seemed like a obvious, sensible trajectory. And I think the two things really led me in a theological direction. One was that I'd come up to university from quite a conservative house church sort of background. I'd been formed in the Church of England, but I'd left that behind. So I came out thinking the world was made in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. Okay. And I hadn't done very much science at university before. I found that the evidence was stacked against that. And that really precipitated quite a crisis of faith, which lasted for a few years. Because it's not just that, it's about, what do you trust? Is the whole thing going to fall down? And I think maybe, well, who knows what would have happened, but what saved my faith and then I think made it strong was encountering the tradition of the Middle Ages, the theology and philosophy of the Middle Ages, especially Thomas Aquinas from the 13th century. And I could just see that these people would have taken all those questions in their stride. They loved posing themselves questions and objections and responding to them. So the things that had kept me awake in a sort of anguished way were still keeping me awake, but in a fascinated way. Right. And I thought, actually, this is a good indication. If you're lying awake, and as it happens, you're not thinking about biochemistry, but you're thinking about theology and philosophy and so on, then maybe that's an indication of a path to take. And I'd also, when I was doing my doctorate, started working in the hospice as a volunteer in Oxford. And that was just so much the most rewarding thing I did in any particular week. Because it seemed to use all of me. Sometimes all you could do was just sit next to someone, or sometimes you had to use your ingenuity to try and think, what have we got in common? What can we talk about? It really felt like it was very holistic. So for that led me towards thinking about ordination. And I had thought I'd left the sciences behind in that respect, but eventually I picked that up and was appointed as the lecturer, then professor in Cambridge in theology and natural sciences. So I really had thought I'd left the sciences behind, and eventually those two parts of my life
turned out to be quite useful in the end.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think of chemistry in Oxford, the person who comes to my mind is Peter Atkins, who I've had on a few interviews and discussion debate shows. Very much a devout atheist. And I think a lot of people might assume the more you investigate that world, certainly this would be Peter Atkins' view, the less evidence there is for God, because you can explain everything in purely scientific, physical, chemical terms. So did that happen? Did you kind of feel any sort of pull in that direction to kind of think, okay, no, the world is purely, in that sense, disenchanted? We can understand it by just what I'm looking at through the microscope here.
Well, I mean him no disrespect, because I went to all his quantum mechanics lectures, and he was a great educator. I don't think I've ever really been convinced by the idea that science answers all the questions that there are to answer. I'm passionately, committed to science, to its importance, but I think the fact that we've investigated that realm, that part of reality so deeply and wonderfully in the ways that we have, doesn't mean that there aren't other questions. George Herbert has a poem about natural philosophers, which is to say scientists, exploring all the different parts of the universe. But then he says there are two other things that we should think about: sin and love. He has two beautiful stanzas about those. And I think that's right. Science is to be esteemed, but it can't tell us what makes a great sonnet or the meaning of human relationships, which is, it would just be unfair to ask the natural sciences to answer those sorts of questions.
If I was channeling the spirit of Peter Atkins, though, and forgive me, Peter, if you are listening, I would probably say something like, well, those are all very subjective questions, the value of a sonnet or whatever. Science is the objective thing. That's the one thing that does have proper, meaningful answers. The rest is all basically opinion.
Well, I'm not sure that something is, unreal or invaluable just because it's has a subjective element to it. And there's a whole question of metaphysics. So-called maybe because it's the book of Aristotle that comes literally on the bookshelf after the physics, but perhaps also because once you've asked all the kinds of questions you can of the physical world, there are still some questions left, like why there's anything rather than nothing, what the nature of causation is. I think there are philosophical questions that transcend, but probably because they lie underneath all scientific questions. And we just do science a discourtesy if we think that it has the capacity to address those sorts of questions.
When you think about your research topics from then to now, more in the science realm, more in the theology realm, definitely places where they overlap. Is there something written into the rock of them all? Is there a thread that holds them all together, which is driving you, do you think?
We have all of us a thirst to know, a wonder to opening ourselves up to what the world's like. But I think they also have a creativity about them. So the late Tom McLeish wrote about this, that we underestimate the way in which the sciences are a creative enterprise. Not because we're making stuff up, but the things that you test, the ideas that you have, your theories, they've got to come from somewhere. They are a human creative enterprise. And in that respect, the sciences are comparable to the humanities. So both are sort of, I think this is going to come up maybe a few times in this podcast, the combination of the sort of objectivity of opening yourself to the reality of what's real and over and against you, but also the fact that you meet that halfway with a sort of creativity. Yeah, I think that's true across all the things we do in a university.
So let me introduce a philosophical term and ask you to explain it in simple layman's language. You describe your philosophical perspective as epistemological realism. So in simple words, what does that mean?
Well, I think realism maybe gets a bad name because in the realm of politics or ethics, it can be sort of hard-nosed pragmatism, Okay. So it wasn't a very nice thing to do, but he's a realist, so he did it.
Okay.
I don't mean realism in that sense. Philosophically, it means, I've mentioned it already, this sense of the reality of that which lies over and against you. That there are things and not just thoughts.
Okay.
And particularly in knowledge or epistemology, is the idea that to know something is to open yourself up to it, to let it impinge upon you, to let it inform you. I think I'm probably a mediated epistemological realist in the sense that I don't think that we ever get to things exactly as they are. I think we only share in things partially. There's always a depth to things.
And the epistemological bit of that phrase, epistemological realism, that refers to the way we come to know things. Is that
so I'd say I'm a realist more generally. So in metaphysics, a realist is someone who thinks that there is really stuff out there, and that things of the same sort have something in common. For instance, in theology, it often is associated with the idea of things coming from God and we're going to talk about this, I imagine, later on, participation.
What's the opposite of that then? What would the non-realist be? What might someone who disagrees with that perspective say is happening when we encounter the world around us?
Well, there have been from time to time strands of idealism that really put the emphasis so much on thought that the world may as well not exist.
Okay.
I find that so difficult to entertain that I can't really get myself into the mind of someone who thinks that way. But there have been, it's either just a completely full-blown idealism, but more often it's more like a sort of orientation that what really matters is thought rather than the things out there. So that would be one contrast. Or I suppose you could say, well, there are things out there, but they're not really meaningful. Or there are things out there and it's all about our imposition, our construction of what they are. That would be also a sort of non-realist move.
But I mean, just to get into the philosophical weeds here a bit, just because this stuff fascinates me. I mean, you could argue that, everything in a sense is mediated by our senses, light rays entering our eyes and being converted into brain signals. And it gives us this world that we see and we think, of course, that's a solid glass that I'm lifting up now, and the water and the taste of it and everything is real. But then, that question remains. Is that just the way my brain is interpreting all of that stuff? Is that actually what that is? Or is it, if I don't know, had some different way of engaging the world, maybe I would conceive of these things completely differently, in the way that, you know, isn't there a famous philosophical essay about what it's like to be a bat or something, and the fact that if you're experiencing the world in sonar, then it's going to look, it'll feel completely different to you in that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a great philosophical maxim that when one thing is received into another, it's received in the manner of the recipient and not in the manner of the thing it comes from, which sounds complicated, but it makes sense.
Open that up.
So if I know an apple,
yeah,
I know the apple in the mental mode of my mind and not in the physical mode of the apple. Happily, it's not physically in my brain, it's mentally in my mind.
Yes.
But similarly, if you receive a landscape into a painting, it's present in the painterly manner of the painting and not as it is in itself. So that's what I mean perhaps by mediation, that you only ever participate in the things we participate in according to our manner or mode. But that's fine, that's all we can expect. So a dolphin knows the world in a dolphin-y sort of way, and perhaps using sonar, for instance. And another animal that sees more colors than we do has a different, in that way, richer appreciation of what it sees. The human being, I suppose, not only sees but understands, and like I said earlier, can kind of bring it into cultural expression. So I'm just very cheerful about finitude. I think it's fine to be this kind of thing and not that kind of thing, and I can only apprehend the world in my way, and if there's life elsewhere in the universe, which I've written about a bit, it'll understand the world in its own way. But our job is just to try and do it well in a human way.
But at the same time, being a realist, it's not completely subjective. There is a real world out there, even if it gets mediated to us in the way that we receive it. It's still a thing that exists in that way.
And even between human beings, one of the things that drives human culture and exchange is because we both apprehend things slightly differently, and we've got stories to tell, and we're interested in what you make of this thing and I make of that thing. So I don't see the particularity and the limitations of what I can make of a thing and what you can make of it to be a problem. In fact, I think it's the springboard for much of the sorts of conversations we're going to have.
Which is interesting, because my initial thought, having just this second been introduced to epistemological realism, is that it makes way for quite a lot of hierarchy, or it could, in that if there is a thing and it's an object thing, like it is what it is, and we're perceiving it differently, is there not space to immediately say, well, who's getting as close to the real thing as possible? And then does that not make way for sort of superiority or anything like that?
It could do, but I think it always helps us to have a certain sense of humility. That, another way of approaching it is to say things are so kind of boundless. There's such a depth to everything that different people will have different apprehensions, different things they can talk about, but they're not necessarily rankable.
Yeah, so that it's not as if one is closer to the truth than another. It's just different.
They can be. It is true. It is possible for things to be mistaken, or crooked or selfish or whatever. I don't want to be completely cheerful about it, but even taking that out of the picture, then there's going to be variety, and variety is a good thing.
I again, apologies for kind of dragging this into philosophical weeds, but what your question to me, Belle, kind of makes me think of the fact that inevitably we may have a conception of something, and there might be a more quote unquote accurate description of that thing from a scientific point of view. So there's this famous philosophical thought experiment called Mary's Room, in which a scientist knows everything there is to know about the color red, and they have all these charts of the synapses that go off when we perceive a color red, all the brain chemistry that's involved, all of the light spectrums. They know it all, but the catch in this experiment is that they live in a completely black and white world. Everything around them is black and white. So Mary knows everything there is to know about the color red at a scientific level, but has never seen the color red. And the question is, does Mary actually know everything about the colour red? Well, no, obviously not, because Mary's never actually experienced the colour red. And I think that for me is an important distinction between, if you like, the way you can know something at one level, at a scientific level, and say, I have a really accurate, and then another very simple way in which we know things where we actually understand something in a way that kind of transcends almost a purely scientific explanation.
That seems convincing to me. That's one reason why I don't find it convincing, for instance, that one could have a sort of neurological reduction of thought. I mean, you could have a perfect, as you say, neurological description of what it means to smell a vanilla pod. But that doesn't mean that we don't smell vanilla pods, and it doesn't tell us anything about what it's like to smell one. So, and I think that's very significant observation.
And I guess that, to really embarrass myself by boiling this down, I think that can really be the case with people. Like, we could, particularly in this social media age, I can know the age, where someone lives, their family, where they like to go for brunch on a Saturday. I can have all of this objective knowledge about someone having never met them. And I think in this age, what's interesting is we would say that that's enough for us to say we know this person, but we've never experienced them. We don't know what they're like in a crisis. We don't know what their presence in a room feels like. We don't know what they smell like. We don't know, So that's quite an interesting, in regards to human relationships, particularly in quite a fragmented, like, we know things from a distance, but we don't really sort of situation.
Just as we're on this philosophical train, and we've got a philosopher in our midst, you say that you were sort of really enlivened by the medieval philosophers and theologians, Thomas Aquinas. To what extent do you find that the arguments that came out of that era, and then subsequently with people like Leibniz, around sort of the fact that there is a universe, there is reality, if you like, that itself points to God? So you had sort of those Thomistic kind of arguments about the need for a first cause. You had later on philosophers talking about the fact, these kind of cosmological arguments, that the universe itself is a contingent thing. There must be a necessary being, i.e. God, behind it all. I've been engaged in some fascinating debates over the years with atheists, on these issues. How persuaded have you been by those kinds of philosophical arguments that reality itself is somehow evidence for God?
I think they are quite important to me, actually. And they might not be, generally speaking, might be only a small proportion of even quite devout people for whom these philosophical considerations mean a great deal, and that's fine. I'm glad you used the language of argument. When people talk about proof, I find that a bit bloodless. And I think also what you get with one hand, you can be taken away with the other. So you might come up with the proof for something, but because the whole thing is sort of contained within human arguments, you end up with the proof for a mere supreme being, which is quite common in certain sorts of religious argument.
A god of the philosophers.
Yes, and I find that a real diminution. I think the argument, your language of argument, or giving reasons for why you believe, is more helpful. And I think it's more that you can say two things. You can say the world is grounded or it's ungrounded. It's meaningful or it's not. There's a reason for it or there's not a reason for it. It's either given or it's an accident. So I think those are, they're both live options in a way. You could just say the world has no reason for it. It isn't grounded in anything. It doesn't come from anywhere. It's just a brute fact. I can't see why you couldn't say that. I just find that unconvincing. It seems to me too glorious and wonderful and meaningful and so on for it just to be
okay. Well, with my Peter Atkins hat on again, then, well, channeling the spirit of the atheist who might sit down and have a problem with that, they might say, well, why should your brute fact trump my brute fact? Why God? Surely God needs an explanation if you're saying the world, reality needs an explanation.
So I think that's a very good thing to come on to. Theologians, philosophers have thought for centuries and centuries about the nature of God, and they've said exactly what you've said, which is anything that's going to stand as a explanation for why there's anything rather than nothing can't be itself in need of that kind of explanation. The broad swathe of the Christian tradition, amongst other religions and philosophical perspectives, have said that God is simple. So God is that one being of, and even to talk about God as if God were a being is probably already a problem, but where everything overlaps with everything else. So God's goodness is God's truth is God's beauty, and all of those are God's being, and God's essence is God's being. So we can say of God that it is God's own nature to be. So unless you can come to some sort of place like that where your mind can come to rest and isn't needing to be looking for further explanations, then you are just one stage on an infinite regress. But Christian tradition has said, and I find it convincing, that the sort of thing that we're talking about, which isn't a thing, when we talk about God, is one whose very nature would be to be. The source that has no source, the reason for everything that doesn't need a reason for itself. So you're completely right, and I suppose it is the question of what you find most convincing as a brute fact. And God, who would be truth himself, seems to me like a more convincing brute fact than this world in all its contingent detail, in which the fact that I have a blue toothbrush is sort of eternally meaningful and as ultimate as anything else you could say.
When you say that God is not a thing and that it's problematic to kind of use him in that terms, but it's kind of the language we've got, it makes me think, and I wonder if I'm getting this right, I'd like you to break it open a little bit, but it makes me think of C.S. Lewis's The Seeing Eye essay, which I think, if I'm right, he wrote in response to the Soviet Union politician Khrushchev. After Gagarin went to space, he said, "I didn't find God up there." The politician said, "Gagarin went into space and he didn't find God up there. Surely that's proof that he doesn't exist." And then C.S. Lewis, being C.S. Lewis, thought, "I'm not having that." And he wrote this beautiful essay, and within it he says that trying to look for God as an object within the universe is trying to look for Shakespeare as a character within one of his plays, or Avon as a place, like we try to look for heaven as a place within the universe. That's like trying to look for Avon as a setting within one of the plays. And then he says that God is to the universe what Shakespeare is to his plays, what meter is to a poem, what a key is to music. And is that what you mean when you say that it's wrong to speak of God as an object within the universe? It's more helpful, maybe more accurate to think of him a bit more like Shakespeare is to his plays.
They're lovely analogies, and people take different perspectives on this. So some people say, "Oh, I can only think about beings. God's one of them."
Okay,
I think that's a problem.
Does that? I imagine that's aided by the fact that we're told we're made in His image, so we think we are being. He is.
I think it comes from a certain philosophical perspective that perhaps could do with a bit of humility.
Okay.
We just haven't got everything sorted out.
Yeah.
So, but that's one pole, and the other pole would be so policing one's language at every moment that one really doesn't say anything at all.
Yeah.
Sometimes called the apophatic approach, the sort of negative approach, the really cautious, mysterious approach. And I think I probably want to live somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Which is that quite a lot of what we say about God does transgress our rules about God not being a thing amongst things or a cause amongst causes, but you try to be as careful as you can, and you put the odd footnote in saying, although I'm saying this, I recognise that I'm doing as best I can within human language and rationality. But I do think it is important to say the cause of all things can't be a cause amongst the God must be to the world much more like the cause that holds all causes in being than just one more cause like the first one. It's why it doesn't really matter how old the universe is, or even if it had a beginning. It's more about what holds everything at every moment in being than it is, what kicked off the first domino.
That's very Julian of Norwich. I think she saw God that way, didn't she? As like the love of God holds everything. It's not another thing within there. Okay, can I ask you an alien-related question? If the existence of the universe is somehow proof of God's existence, and I've heard people say that intelligent life, it adds weight to that, what if other intelligent life were to exist? Does that add to the pile of, see, this is more evidence because it's not a coincidence, it's not an accident, it's not nothingness, it's happened here, here, and here? Or is it the other way? Or does it tip the other way and say, we must be an accident because there are accidents all over the universe?
Well, I should say that although philosophy matters quite a lot to me, it doesn't to everyone or to most people. And if their belief in God rests upon the figure of Jesus, as mine does too, or the holiness of the saints, or whatever, I'm not wanting to push people into a philosophical box. On Life Beyond Earth, you mentioned C.S. Lewis. There's a nice little essay he wrote called Religion and Rocketry, where he says, if it turns out we're the only life in the universe, people will say, ha, look, it's just some kind of absurd accident. And if it turns out there's lots of life in the universe, then people will say, well, nothing special about you then. And they'll use it, and they'll use it against religious belief either way. Historically, Christian theologians have been writing about this since about the middle of the 15th century, Life Beyond Earth,
which is wild.
And have sowed, and other Jews and Muslims even a little bit earlier, and I would say Christians have generally just taken it in their stride. So there's kind of frustratingly little written about life beyond Earth, because there is quite a lot, but it's never very long.
Is it because it just didn't freak them out?
It didn't freak them out. So they would maybe you get a sentence, a paragraph, a page, and then they would move on. So I certainly don't think that the discovery of life beyond Earth should be any kind of threat, because so many theologians, so many religious writers have actually, in a way they've been a bit profligate. You find people writing, there must be life wherever it's possible, because you wouldn't have a habitable place that didn't have inhabitants, because habitability is for habitation. Now that's probably a mistake. I'm sure it is a mistake. And other places, other features of the universe can be marvelous without having to include life. So I think that's a bit of a flawed argument, but it's certainly true that there's much of an impulse towards thinking that the universe is full of life, as there has been any worry about, any sense that it could be a threat to us.
When it comes to how life began on our planet, again, this is an area I've been fascinated to talk to various people about, and it does appear to be rather extraordinary that life came together, if it's just down to natural causes, because of the incredible complexity of the first self-replicating DNA molecule and what needed to happen in order for life to get going. Even if some sort of naturalistic process of evolution took place after that, there's still just that first speck of life that had to exist. I know that you've spent time thinking about this and researching it yourself. Does any of that, again, for some people, that gives them warrant to say, well, perhaps we need more than just a physical explanation here. Maybe there's something about life that does point to God, that something special happened when that first microbe of life, emerged on planet Earth.
Well, I do work quite a lot with scientists on this question, and I think I'm going to differ from you in saying that I would really want to give the scientists their moment, or all the time that they need to think about origins of life in a natural way. I think that there's something wonderful about the way in which the universe is conducive to bringing forth life, that it's there woven in. That's where I would see the fingerprints of God, in the capacity of the universe to bring forth life, rather than saying we need a miracle. So Aquinas, commenting on the beginning of Genesis, says, in the first foundation of things, we should look more for that which is with the grain of nature rather than miracles. Partly just for God of the gaps reasons. I think if you say, look, you should believe in God because there's no plausible jump from A to B, and then we find out how nature can go from A to B, then you're exposed, as it were.
And God just becomes a useful filler for things we don't know about yet.
So in a terrible pun, I would much rather see God in the whole with a W at the front rather than whole without a W.
I like it. That's really helpful. I think it leads us neatly, though, into a sense that idea that there is this holistic way of looking at the way God uses the nature of the universe to bring about life and so on, that you've also obviously delved into when it comes to this idea of participation, and acknowledging what we already said, that you believe there is a universe out there, a sort of a reality to be that kind of is independent of us and that we discover and so on. Why is participation such an important thing? And perhaps you could just explain what you mean by that phrase, because at one level you could say, well, you know, things can carry on perfectly well without us. Are humans just sort of, I don't know, an additional layer on top of, you know, a universe that's running along quite smoothly by itself without necessarily our needing to be part of it? What is it about us being here and participating in the world that we find ourselves in that's so significant?
Well, the theological sense of participation really has as its core the participation of everything in God, our participation in Christ, our participation in God, in seeing God face to face, is used broadly. And I wrote a book on this partly because it seemed that the idea of participation was turning up in lots of different registers or domains, but they weren't necessarily being thought about together. So I wanted to write something that drew them together. The root idea of participation is basically sharing. And like sharing in or sharing from. And sharing from doesn't work particularly well in English, but we have an older way of talking, says being a partaker of, which is that kind of idea. So sharing from, sharing in. And so with respect to creation, for instance, it's the idea that creation is a sharing from God. What God is in God's own self, God gives us a likeness to the world. So why is there being? Why is there goodness? Why is there truth? They are a sharing from and a likeness to what God is in himself. Already I've talked about participation, I suppose, in saying that to know something is to share in it. And although ideas of sin and redemption are really important in theology, perhaps even more ultimate is to say God doesn't just put us right, but gives us a share in God's own life and joy. Or that sharing in God, which is our constitution as the kind of things that we are, we sort of muck that up through our sin. And then redemption is putting that participation right, you know, reforming us to be in the image of God. So participation is a fantastic idea. It's shared. It's important in the Bible. It's also important in Plato. So Christians down the centuries have thought they could really do business with forms of Platonic philosophy because Platonists had also thought very carefully about these ideas. And it's increasingly an idea that's shared across Christian traditions. So I get Southern Baptists and sort of the sorts of Anglicans that I don't normally go to that sort of church, getting in touch with me and saying, I read your book and I really enjoyed it. Can you come and talk at my Southern Baptist University or whatever? So there's a wonderful sense that between Protestants of all sorts, Catholics, Anglicans, Orthodox, there's a real buzz in the air about this idea of participation.
Would participation be just a human privilege?
Absolutely not. If the doctrine of creation means anything, it's the idea that everything about everything comes from God. Creation out of nothing. There's no uncreated substrate beneath things. Yeah. Everything is God's gift. So everything in its way participates in God. The human being, traditionally, people have talked about all sorts of things, but memory, intellect, and will being a new level of participation. Partly because the world comes to be reflected within you with those things. You have a new level of engagement with the world, a new participation in the world, I suppose, through those sorts of capacities. But every creature, every living creature, interacts with its world, and even every speck of dust, from a theological perspective, has all that it has from God.
And so, when you're talking about participation, and you're talking about God, and you're talking about us, is it that we are literally kind of, when we encounter the world, the physical world around us, and perhaps we start to kind of layer it with new levels of meaning when we create stories and art and music and so on, is it that we are doing something with God in that sense? Is it that we kind of become sort of co-creators at some level with God when we're in that state?
Christian writers, and especially the ones I'm most naturally enthusiastic about, have often been pretty twitchy about the idea of human beings or any creature as a creator. And that's partly, that's really just because they've defined creation as God's great act of calling all things out of nothing. And if that's what you mean by creation, well, no creature can do that.
We're just rearranging bits, essentially.
But I think within that, within time and space and matter and created being and all that we receive, I think there is real creaturely creativity. I mean, I'd happily talk about bowerbirds and spiders and things and their creativity, but certainly human beings have this kind of creativity, which seems to me a kind of echo of God's great creativity, given to us, completely derived, but nonetheless real. I think this is a really important theme in participation. On the one hand, it wants to say everything that we have from another, but on the other hand, what we have, we really have. God doesn't create ciphers or wisps or spectres. Makes real things with real capacities. And that idea of derivation, I think, is important in all human creativity. So we don't just have all our capacities from God, but we also have no artist is doing anything other than working within all of the history of art that she's encountered. The great composers often work very much with material that they've received, within structures and ways of doing things that they've received. So I find this idea of on the one hand real creativity, but on the other hand always working within the framework of what you're given. And it isn't just rearranging. There's genuine novelty in the cathedral, and they're singing some, I don't know, mass setting by one of the great Renaissance composers. It's full of conventions. Probably one of the main tune has been brought from a plain song hymn. They're absolutely working with the grain of this tradition that they've received, and yet you have in front of you this amazing new creative thing. So it just seems to me that those things always go together. They're not opposed to one another. The what we receive and then what we add to it. You never get one without the other.
Yeah. For those, does it filter all the way down? So for those who would say, I actually don't think this exists, but for those who would say, I'm not creative, I don't create anything, I don't think that's true. But for those who feel like that's not a part of what they do in the world, is just our being participation as well?
It is. I would be with you, I think, here in wanting to reassure someone about their creativity, that there's a strand, it comes into English thought, particularly through Coleridge, who said that he came up with two ideas of imagination. And there's one kind of imagination that's writing novels and painting poems and things, painting paintings and writing poems. He said that actually is subordinate or based on another kind of imagination, which is the imagination that is involved in every thought, in every that he didn't think that you could think anything or perceive anything without it being a sort of bringing forth on your part as well. And so in that sense, it's not just when the artist is doing some great painting, but in any human interaction or in any observation of nature, there is a sort of creativity there.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier, that even the scientific act is creative, even though it's sort of exploring objectively the world around us, it still involves a kind of the imagination and the creativity of the scientist to formulate a theory and to go out and test it and so on. But I can imagine like a lot of your secular scientific colleagues from back in your biochemistry days probably never thought about God in terms of the activities they were doing. They probably sort of said, well, that's what you do on a Sunday if you're into that. What I'm doing here in the lab is quite a separate activity. But so what would you say, I suppose, at a practical level to someone who just has never sort of thought about this idea that even as a scientist is participating in God? How would you kind of begin to explain that from where they're sitting?
Well, I think I take a relatively, provocative line on this, which is perfectly fine and probably right for the scientists not to be thinking about God all the time. So there are people who work on science and religion who would disagree with me on this. They think you're kind of selling the pass, or you're giving the baby away with the bathwater. But I think that the world has an intelligibility. I think that comes from God. but precisely because it's given by God, it's real. And it's the job of the scientist to investigate it. And I would frankly, qua scientist, rather than my scientist was genuinely attending to the reality that's in front of them, rather than, too busy singing psalms to really be looking down the microscope. So I think it's fine and even proper that you should pay reality the respect that it deserves, sort of on its own terms. And I don't think that's incompatible with a theological perspective. Then there are other questions that one can ask, but I don't want to. I think there's a proper separation of domain and activity there.
Can we speak specifically about blessing? Because you've written on this as well, and it's actually a word that in sort of my circles is kind of rising to the surface again, which is really interesting. So I really kind of want to ask you, because I think to some people who aren't Christians, it's quite a superstitious thing or just a strange thing, and I'm sure it ties so deeply into participation. But what are the mechanics of blessing? What's the purpose of it? What's the nature of it? Can you just break it open and then we can kind of go from there?
I think I probably need a whole episode.
Yeah, probably.
And I can do that terrible authorly thing and say, it's in the
Buy
book.
my
Read the book.
Read the
Well,
book.
do that. Buy the book.
It's literally called blessing.
It is.
Yeah.
I think all sorts of things are going on in blessing. One of them is like recognition and confession of this thing or object.
Okay.
But we bless things, we bless people, places,
Yes.
endeavors. Part of what you're doing is you're just owning up to the fact that this is important and comes from God. So there's a sort of just not changing things, but just recognizing them angle.
Which would be the way you would rather re-enchantment be framed.
Exactly. There's a
Okay.
good link there. There's also, I think, an aspect of prayer. So people say a blessing's efficacious. And there have been theologians in the 70s and 80s didn't really like that idea. I say, well, apart from anything else, it's a prayer. And if in whatever way you think prayer has an efficacy, then a blessing as a prayer is no less efficacious. There's a strong element of, in certain kinds of blessing, of putting things aside. So we bless some things for use in everyday life, but there are other things that we bless or consecrate, is often the word, in order to set them aside for a particular purpose. So a church building, you don't just do anything in a church building because it's been set aside for a really important purpose, the worship of God. If you bless a chalice, you wouldn't then just use it at a dinner party. Nothing wrong with dinner parties, but it's been. And I think there's a real link here, say, with marriage. So you are setting yourself aside for one person, and so holiness in the biblical tradition has a lot to do with this sense of setting aside, of dedication. So you're doing that. I think you're perhaps also recognizing that the world has evil in it. And part of what the tradition has been doing with blessing is a sort of pushing back against that, which again probably wasn't very popular in the theology of the 70s and 80s, but I think is probably a bit more back on the table. So, and the question of superstition, I think coming from a Christian tradition where we bless things a lot and places and endeavors and so on, for me it's about inhabiting my journey with God amongst other people as the kind of creature that I am, which is bodily, in place, in a world full of things. And I think that the rather tangible, practical business of blessing things just recognizes that I'm not a disembodied object, a disembodied spirit. I live in a world of things. So if being a religious person in a bodily, material, world full of things way is superstitious, then I'm happy to own that.
Be superstitious.
Yeah, own that label. And of course, the world is full of superstition. I mean, it's not like, I think people navigate the world in a way that places and things, people, relationships are special. And we do strange things. We do physical things. We leave flowers. You can help. You're the experts on contemporary culture. You can think of the examples, but there's lots of superstitious navigation of the world out there. I think the question is what's it orientated towards, not whether we're going to do it because I think
people are doing things that probably are equivalents, and very often they're doing them sort of in in all kinds of environments. I mean, I remember when the Queen died, and a lot of people wanted to pay their respects. You had this miles long queue, people.
The queue, the Elizabeth line.
Yeah, absolutely. And people kind of coming in, when they finally got to the coffin lying in state, searching for some symbol, and it might have been, people who were religious might have crossed themselves or something, but others wanted to do something. There was something about that needed to be marked, and I just think people are still looking for those kinds of ways. Everything you were saying was reminding me of years ago, some friends of ours, shortly after they got married and moved into their first flat, they were going to a sort of quite Anglo-Catholic church, and that wasn't my tradition at the time. And so for the first time, I saw their priest come round and bless every room in the house as we went through their flat. And I've had, I would have sort of just thought, well, I just need to pray in my head for this couple, or maybe with them or something. It was a bit novel to me to be going into every room and sprinkling holy water and sort of saying this, we're dedicating this room, and but it was quite nice as well. And what for you is important about that kind of the physicality, in that sense of going and sprinkling water on something and blessing it in that very kind of physical way?
Well, I'm going to say, as I've probably said a couple of times, you can be a Christian in all sorts of different ways, and if that's not your way of doing things, I'm not going to pour scorn on it. For me, it's all the things I've said, taking matter, place, the body seriously. That's the way we live all the rest of our lives. Why not live our religious lives that way too? And the water, of course, is a strong link back to baptism. The original holy water is the water of baptism. So it's about that sacrament, that sense that this is where we encounter salvation. And the layering of the waters at the beginning of creation, the waters of baptism, the water from the side of Christ, that it's actually, I think, a way of living within the biblical story with this, which is itself is picking up one layer and connecting it to another.
I suppose the question that I came back to was, well, has this blessing changed the physical space, or is it just for the benefit of the people? Is it more sort of, and I've had this discussion sometimes when it comes to, Holy Communion, sacrament, where obviously different Christian traditions sort of believe quite different things actually about what happens at the moment of blessing. And in a Catholic tradition, obviously something physical essentially happens. There's a difference there. Whereas perhaps in other Christian traditions, it's much more about, well, the meaning is more about how I approach that, but I can still, the bread itself, I could still feed to the birds afterwards if it's left over or whatever. Whereas that would be sacrilege, in a Catholic tradition. So what for you is it? Is it? Do you tend to err more on the side of no, something's changed once it's been blessed in the physicality of that thing, that place is different now, or is it more the sort of, no, it's for the sake of the people who are going to be using that space that we're doing this?
I think if I want to push back against that question, it's partly the idea that the disposition of atoms is somehow what's the real thing, and then everything else is relatively insignificant change. So for something to change in the way in which we view it, the way in which it features in our lives, the stories we tell about it, that seems to be not an insignificant story. And then the religious traditions have a sense of spiritual realms that places, human institutions, they have a sort of spiritual identity to them. And I don't understand that particularly well, and I think it tends to be pretty dangerous or worrisome when people do try to become experts in that. But it does seem to be part of the Christian tradition, and I would think that blessing things and places and endeavours does change that spiritual quality of things.
Yeah, there's I said this off camera, but I'll say it again. I came across a clip of someone recently in a podcast, and she was saying how she wishes, she's not Christian, so she wishes there was a secular version of blessing. And I kind of wanted to ask you about two parts of that. Firstly, I just think it's interesting that even people who aren't religious in any way, as she wasn't, have this craving to participate in quite a specific way. And so what does that say about us? Are we built to want to participate in ways that go beyond our own capabilities? That's probably not bulletproof language, but I hope you know what I mean. And so my second question, I guess, would be, is there such thing as a secular blessing? Can that exist, or is that an oxymoron? Is that, a square peg, round hole?
That sounds like an important question for a second edition of the book.
Well, if you've got a bit of time on your hands.
I mean, probably it would be a bit of a stretch, but there is a sense in which, especially in one of the sort of 20th century emphasis in thinking about this, that everybody can bless within their own domain. So parents bless children. It's been the tendency has been to try and take it out of just the hands of priests and bishops and say that within one's walk of life there's a capacity to bestow blessings. The Jewish tradition is terrific here, with lots of blessings, which are sort of actually mainly like ascriptions of praise to God and recognition of God's hand in things. And as you go through life, if you're in that sort of Jewish tradition, you meet various things. The first tree you've seen in bloom, a particularly tall person, all sorts of things. There's a thing that you say to greet them. So in that sense, I'm not going to say to somebody, "Hey, you're not on my turf. Don't do this thing." What sort of theological account or what account they give of what they're doing may or may not make a great deal of sense to me, but I think that human impulse, I'm probably not going to want to suppress it.
No. And I think as you're hinting there, Belle, it is kind of innate in us to want to both to bless things and to thank God for things, even if, and sometimes, I can't remember who it was, but someone once said the atheist's worst problem is wanting to being thankful but having no one to thank. There's a sort of sense in which I think there is a sense in which deep down we do want to bless things and thank something for things and everything else. And I think you do see some traditions try to kind of, put that peg in the square hole or whatever by saying, no, I can, have a ceremony, a sort of humanistic, secular ceremony for a birth or marriage, a death, and so on. What for you is lacking there if you can't sort of acknowledge a sort of a transcendent reality when you're essentially trying to mark something that as significant and important in that kind of way?
I think I'm going to dodge that partly and say it's just my disposition to say I'm more inclined to acknowledge and be grateful for what there is there rather than
criticize it.
Criticize it.
Yeah.
I mean, or at least if I can have a criticism, I want it to be a friendly conversation with someone over a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, rather than just criticizing into a vacuum. Yeah. I hope that's not too much of a dodge.
No, it's not a dodge, because I would be very similar to you. I'd say I want to acknowledge that the impetus that is there and then have a conversation around it. I suppose it's for the atheist humanist to tell you, well, what does it mean to you when it comes to what you're blessing or giving thanks for?
Part of the problem often is either bad theology or a bad construal of theology. So I've had conversations. I remember a conversation with a philosopher, basically about whether goodness was real, and I don't think that he was that far from a religious perspective. But what he took a religious perspective to be was an old man on a cloud. Like Herbert McCabe said, like the President of the United States, only bigger and invisible. But he did think that there was a good which was the source of all goodness. And I'm closer to that than I am the President of the United States, only bigger and invisible. So it's both investigating, talking to people about their own territory, but also perhaps saying, well, you don't believe that, but don't worry, I don't believe that either.
Absolutely.
I think so much of the new atheism is reacting to a God that, like, no significant theologian in 2,000 years has ever proposed.
I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in either, as someone said, put it. I think that I'd agree with all of that, and I think, as I say, in reality, most people could go through life, even if they don't believe in God, they still have. They're not sort of scientific materialists either. Most of the time, they're sort of doing things and recognizing things that sort of speak about some kind of belief in the transcendent or some kind of assumption going on there. How would you say then this idea of blessing? How does that sort of work out with I suppose people in their everyday lives? At what level do you think this idea of blessing things is that something that is just for Christians, or is it something that kind of can be manifest, for anyone? Is there a case, I suppose, for the local parish priest to be offering a blessing to anyone, whether they consider themselves Christian or not, to sort of say this is something that is just available at that level for anyone?
It's a very good question, and I think my completely natural impulse and my practice would be to say I would meet people where they are and offer what I can. So I think when I was a curate, there was a Hindu couple who I got to know quite well. They were going to be evicted, and I helped with that case, and they became really supporters of the church because the church had been on their side. And they did come to the church, and they asked for when the husband was sick and he was going to be in hospital, I didn't anoint him because that's a sacrament, belongs within the Christian order, and partly respecting his religious tradition for being what it was, but also for saying there's a way into the sacramental life of the church, and it's baptism. But I was happy to pray. I went to his house and prayed for him. So similarly, it's slightly case by case, I'm sure, but I think in as much as partly blessing is responding to God's goodness in nature, I feel like I can do that beyond the bounds of the church if people want it. Yeah.
You've used another word there that's worth unpacking, sacramental. So what does that mean? And what are the things in that sense that are sort of set apart as a special kind of form of blessing within the Christian tradition?
Well, I think that sacramental or sacramentality refers to the way in which one encounters God, interacts with God, that the grace or aid of God comes through material things and human gestures and signs. So in that sense, taken broadly, things like blessing would fall within that. And they are, in fact, sometimes given the name sacramentals, like going on a pilgrimage or receiving ash on Ash Wednesday or kneeling, or these are, they're not one of the 7 sacraments or however many you accept, but they have something of that quality. But at the center of this way of looking at things would be these 2 or 7 sacraments. And even if people disagree about whether to call marriage a sacrament, it's held in high honor. And I think in the church there's much less worry about that. People,
what are the 7 sacraments for those who don't know?
Baptism in the Eucharist, ordination, confirmation, marriage, penance or confession and penance, and anointing of the sick.
Right.
And as I say, even if people don't necessarily want to put all of those in one category, relatively few Christians are going to be disparaging about any of those. And what distinguishes them would be kind of seriousness and an account of efficacy. So it's nice to have your church consecrated, but that's nothing compared to baptism and the Eucharist,
right,
which makes you Christian and feeds you with the body and blood of Christ. It's good to go on a pilgrimage, but if I've committed a really grave wrongdoing, I want to make a confession and have an absolution. So partly the sacraments in one way or another are about salvation. And so they just have a seriousness about them. And I wouldn't want to push blessings in any way that sort of tried to encroach on that territory. And then the other thing that has said to be to distinguish them is the sense of efficacy. So the blessings, going on a pilgrimage, Ash Wednesday, the emphasis maybe is on the subjective. They're about helping me to have a certain kind of intellectual, spiritual journey. It's quite a lot about my state and what they do for me. The idea is with baptism, with very minimal requirements. Like you just really have to intend it. If the water is poured and the words are said, the person is baptized. We don't need to quibble about details. So the emphasis we're coming back to realism again, the emphasis with the sacraments is absolutely on God and the sureness of God's faithfulness and grace. Whereas with these other things that are more in the penumbra, they are about God, but we basically get as much out of them as we're willing to put in a certain way.
Seeing that we should wrap things up, however reluctant we are, I'd love to just finish just with a quick question about bringing things back full circle, back where we started, because in a way I think everything that we've spoken about can almost be held in where you started and where I'd love you to end. This idea of enchantment, but loving the way you're framing it, in particular, as the Re-Enchanting podcast, how can we re-notice the enchantment of things all around us? And I think that blessing is a beautiful option. But how would do you have any other kind of...
Well, I think anything that aids attention. And we live in an age when there's a whole economy that's trying to steal our attention.
Yes, yeah.
So attending to nature, spending time actually looking at the fungus on a tree or something like that, drawing, all those sorts of practices that help us to see are important. Attending to people. I find the stories of great goodness to be that's more likely to reduce me to tears than even great evil. I think that there's something about human courage and goodness when you encounter it that just stops me in my tracks. I find that is a great antidote to nihilism. Hear the stories of the saints and people who've just done the right thing in terrible circumstances. I find it very difficult to believe that nothing means anything. So attention, thankfulness, practices of thankfulness I think are important. Even just saying grace after, saying thank you for a meal. The arts, I think they're all about attending to the sort of inexhaustibility of things. So with music, you might get a fragment of a tune and someone's able to weave 30 variations out of it. I think that's a kind of attentiveness to the depths that are in things. Going on a journey, making a bit of a pilgrimage. I think this is a way of attending to things. But for me, I didn't know where to stop, really. I mean, sing or go dancing. I don't know.
I suppose that's my concern, is we do live in, as you say, this culture which lots of things are vying for our attention, not least the devices we all now carry around in our pocket. And that can stop us from being attentive to actually the enchantedness of the world, and kind of tends to lead you down a very materialistic, utilitarian. So we talked about this at length with Ian McGilchrist, whose work I'm sure you're familiar with as well. And the fact that, yes, what you attend to really does shape the way you end up seeing the world. And if we're constantly essentially mediating that attention through very sort of, the devices and things, it does lead to a kind of disenchantment, that we end up seeing the world purely in these material terms. Whereas if we just stop and engage the world on its own terms, sometimes suddenly it'll do the work for us. You don't have to, do anything. It just suddenly things become more enchanted.
Yeah. So don't worry too much about the in re-enchantment. And I've mentioned Plato before. He has this sense of the stages that you go on to open yourself up to the good and the true and the real and so on. And one of those important stages is mathematics. So it won't be for everybody, but because I've been writing a bit about AI in recent years, I've been trying to get certain aspects of my maths up to speed. And devices are not entirely a bad thing. There are some fantastic, really wonderful YouTube videos on every aspect of maths you can imagine. And the nearest thing I had last year to a sort of platonic mystical experience was one of these lectures about linear algebra, and about, well, I won't go into the details of it, but I was just, my jaw dropped before what's woven into the nature of things, the strings that bind things together, the things that you get all this data and you do a certain kind of analysis of it, and just everything that's meaningful about it pops out the other end. It's the singular value decomposition. So not for everyone, but Plato says mathematics, it can be a good step towards seeing the enchantment in all things. And if that's your bag, then I recommend those videos.
Absolutely. So good to talk to you about the core subject of this podcast, enchantment, and keep on enchanting in your corner of Oxford and as a Regius Professor of Divinity. Andrew, thank you for joining us on the show.
It's a pleasure
today.
to be here.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as we have. I think, to be fair, Andrew, you came very close to re-enchanting reality. I think that's as close as we'll ever get, as comprehensive as we'll ever get. If you want more from Re-Enchanting, we are on YouTube. We are wherever you get your podcasts. If you want more from Seen and Unseen, and I'm very happy to say that there are multiple pieces from Andrew on seenandunseen.com that you can enjoy and love and explore. And also, if you fancy making future conversations like this happen, seenandunseen.com/give is where all of the details are. But for now, we will see you next time.